Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the National Webinar on Flexible Learning Pathways in Higher Education in Jamaica, which is jointly organized by the University Council of Jamaica and the International Institute for Educational Planning. Flexible Learning Pathways is a component of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4, in the Education 2030 Agenda, which advocates for better articulated and equitable higher education systems that promote lifelong learning and flexible learning opportunities for young people and adults. Flexible learning pathways allow for the recognition of formal, informal, and national education and to provide opportunities for students and adults in order to access, progress, and complete a higher education degree which would enable their transition into the labor market. The International Institute for Education Planning conducted a global study on flexible learning pathways in higher education. Jamaica was invited to participate, and the University Council of Jamaica was selected to lead this project, given its long-standing experience with the Jamaican higher education sector and its quality assurance and accreditation mandate. We thank the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information for endorsing the UCJ's participation as country lead organization on this international research. The objective of the IIEP UNESCO research project is to provide policy advice to ministries of education that are considering building or strengthening flexible learning pathways as an area of future reform. The findings of the research on the Jamaican case study is the focus of this webinar. We extend a warm welcome to the Honorable Robert Nestor Morgan, Minister of State, Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, who is deputizing for Minister Fayval Williams, Minister of Education, Youth and Information. Also welcome to Dr. Grace McLean, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, the Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, Mrs. Colette Roberts-Risden, Dr. Angela Brown-Burke, Opposition Spokesperson for Education, Professor Errol Morrison, Chairman of the UCJ, and Professor Orlando Patterson, Chairman of the Education Transformation Commission. A special welcome is extended to our presenters, Dr. Michaela Martin, Program Specialist and Coordinator for this international research project, Ms. Uliana Furiv from IIEP UNESCO, Dr. Fariel Khan, UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean, Ms. Serpa Moitos from the Finnish Education Evaluation Center, and Dr. Caroline Hale, consultant, and our own Dr. Dawn Barrett Adams. Also joining our webinar are council members, interviewees who participated in the project, as well as principals and presidents of the higher education institutions and their staff, heads of organizations, and colleagues from the Ministry of Education and its agencies, as well as the UCJ staff. Jamaica is one of 8 countries which was selected to conduct a case study on its flexible learning pathways in higher education. The other participating countries are Chile, Finland, India, Malaysia, Morocco, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. Their country research teams who were involved in this global research have also joined us in this webinar. Welcome. I'd like to advise that the webinar is streamed live on the Zoom platform and YouTube. And we ask that if you would like to post a question or a comment, please use the chat rooms for those platforms. We also ask that you place your questions in the question and answer section before the question and answer section of our program. I now invite Dr. Arlene Lawrence to bring a word of prayer. Dr. Lawrence.
Thank you, Mrs. Heron. And good morning, Minister Morgan, the ministry and other officials, presenters, and colleagues all. Let's pray. Mighty God and caring Father, thank you for your reality in our lives and in the world, for good and not for evil. We remember this morning all the peoples of the world and continue to ask that you meet each of us at our point of need. Thank you for the higher education community and for research to facilitate further national development. We present this session today to you and ask for your wisdom and coherence for each presenter and for your blessings on all of us. We ask these things and we give you praise in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Professor the Honorable Errol Morrison is well known to us and wears many hats. He is best known for his medical research and work in the treatment of diabetes. However, in the field of education, he was Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean of the School for Graduate Studies and Research at the University of the West Indies, and the former President of the University of Technology in Jamaica. Today, he is with us as Chairman of the University Council of Jamaica, and we now invite him to bring opening remarks. Professor Morrison.
Thank you. ED is my affectionate way of referring to us here, Executive Director. A warm, extended welcome to our visiting panel from the North, and a welcome to our discussants on the panel, members of the participating group, attendees, etc. When I was asked to bring some greetings or opening remarks, and I read the first 3 lines, flexible learning pathways, I literally stood up, because some 2 decades ago, I started struggling with this kind of concept. And every time I put my ideas on a conference table, I was literally shooed out of the room as a heretic. Now, it's like coming full circle, and I guess if you live long enough, all sorts of things happen. And my remarks will be brief because I know you're undoubtedly going to be discussing these, but my heart is full about certain aspects of flexible learning. And I just want to touch on 3 main ones. Firstly, especially in our setting, we need to be conscious of the entry point of a number of our students into higher education. And I think, and I've said it time and again, what we say ad nauseam, it is not the entry point that matters so much as the outlet point. When they have entered, gotten exposed to our degree programs, what it is that we are graduating is really the test of the quality of our education system. And if we need at this level, and if we need to introduce remedial programs, etc., to ensure that they can come up to the requisite standards, then I think it is incumbent upon us. And I ignore comments from colleagues when they say, let them be properly prepared before they enter the higher education system. I negate that kind of approach. Secondly, the other thing I've always emphasized is not so much learning in our long life as learning from our long life. And we have not yet grasped and embraced that what you call the cultural experience, what you call in common parlance, the university of life. In other words, that which we have acquired in our professional undertakings our private avocation, what have we gathered in terms of experience and learning that can be assessed and evaluated within the halls of academia and recognized for its equivalence in academic achievement? What we call in some settings experiential, degree programs, which again, I was laughed out of conference rooms when I mentioned that already in a number of institutions in Europe and even in the USA. They have been considering, especially at the doctoral level, experiential, graduate programs based on what an individual has managed to achieve through his years or her years of experience in their professional avocation, etc. So that matter of translating the life experience, separate and apart from lifelong learning in the traditional sense, we must, especially in our setting, where we have had a number of others outside of the educational system, moving and pioneering and introducing all kinds of new concepts, innovating, in other words. These kinds of achievements need to be recognized. And I think this whole experiential consideration is a must. And lastly, one of the things that I have been talking about, and it has been on the horizon even before this digital revolution, as we're ready to call it, because as we've been seeing, I've been in this thing too long, literally. We have been seeing an evolution in the horizon, in the landscape of occupational opportunities. Things have been changing from the lawyer, doctor, Indian chief, okay? And there are a number of new opportunities which we never even thought of have been coming to the fore. And this has been literally exploded in this fourth industrial revolution, as we are calling it. But what am I getting at? This standard curricula for various advanced programs are locked into some kind of regimented structure. And when I mention this, a number of institutions say, we're doing it already. But I'm yet to see and be convinced that that is so, because I'm not just talking now of if you're within the so-called faculty, that you may miss a credit program, in this semester, that you can do it in next semester or at some other time. I'm talking now about cross-faculty credit opportunities that an individual may need to use to build up their so-called bespoke, program for their needs as they see the future of their intentions will require. And many of our programs, as they now are not built, not even thinking of these professional opportunities in the future. So the individual student, having read ahead, having learned the requisite programs that may be necessary, may need to be cross-cutting faculties in order to pick up the various courses to pull together a customized degree program, what you may very well call the cafeteria education experience. These have been heresy in a number of the halls that I have traveled, and I've traveled many over these several decades. And I would think that within this context of your flexible learning pathways, it must be a part of this discussion. So I am so happy to be here. I'm going to sit and learn, and I wish you all a hectic, provocative, controversial, vigorous, exciting workshop. Have a great day.
Thank you, Professor Morrison, for those encouraging words. We have taken note of the cafeteria experience, the value of experiential learning, as well as the whole matter of it's not necessarily what you enter with, but what you leave with in terms of the passage through the higher education institutions. Now, the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean in Jamaica serves 20 small island developing states in the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. Dr. Fariel Khan is the program specialist for education in the UNESCO Caribbean office. Dr. Khan has a wealth of experience in advising on educational reforms, policy and planning in over 30 countries worldwide, and leads technical advice pertaining to Sustainable Development Goal number 4. She will now bring special remarks. Dr. Khan?
Hello. Hello. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Your Excellency, Minister of State, distinguished Permanent Secretary, representatives of the University Council of Jamaica, dear colleagues from IIEP Paris, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is really my honor to join you today and bring greetings from the UNESCO Office of the Caribbean. I thank Dr. Don Barrett Adams of the University Council of Jamaica and Dr. Michaela Martin, my dear colleague at IIEP Paris, for this excellent study on the flexible learning pathways in higher education, which is timely and relevant. The current health pandemic will leave its mark on higher education in the medium and long term, and we will need robust evidence to inform policy and practice. In terms of policy responses, countries in the Latin America and the Caribbean region have focused in 3 key areas: administrative measures to safeguard operations of higher education institutions, resources, and the provision of resources to continue training activities. UNESCO reaffirms the right to higher education for all within a framework of equal opportunities and non-discrimination as a first priority. The UNESCO principle is to leave no student behind, in line with the main objectives of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And it is undeniable that the crisis, however, is deepening existing inequalities and is generating new ones. Within the context of the current crisis, our Office ASIALC for Latin America and the Caribbean, focusing on higher education, recommends that governments include higher education in the stimulus plans for economic and social recovery, forge a national consensus for a strategy for fostering recovery and innovation in higher education, and provide a clear regulatory environment when reopening of classrooms that generate security and safety and well-being of learners. I look forward to the findings of the study, and I'm confident the findings will provide valuable evidence to inform flexible pathways for higher education in the Caribbean and also in Jamaica. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Mr. Robert Nestor Morgan is the Minister of State in the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information. He was formerly a senator. While at the Office of the Prime Minister, he was Parliamentary Secretary and Director of Communications. He has worked in media and communications for over 13 years, the last 8 of which focused on social media, strategic communications, and public relations. Minister Morgan has a law degree from the University of London, and we now invite Minister Morgan to bring greetings.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be deputizing for my minister, the Honorable Favour Williams. And I would like to recognize Mrs. Paulette Robert Risden, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, our own Dr. Grace McLean, Acting Permanent Secretary here at the Ministry of Education, Dr. Angela Brown-Burke, who is the opposition spokesperson on education, and the Professor Morrison, chairman of the UCJ, Professor Orlando Patterson, who chairs the recently launched Education Commission, a very important commission for the transformation of education, and Dr. Michaela Martin, program specialist, Dr. Fariel Khan, UNESCO Cluster Officer of the Caribbean, Ms. Serpa Moitos, Finnish Education Evaluation Center, Dr. Carolyn Hale, who is a consultant on the project, UCJ Council members, Commissioners of Education, Transformation Commission, principals and presidents of higher education institutions, and all participants. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to bring greetings. I consider this initiative very important, especially in the context of where our education system is currently. The Ministry of Education, Youth and Information therefore welcomes this initiative by the IIEP, UNESCO, and the UCJ. And I think this webinar and the presentation of research findings on flexible learning pathways is another cornerstone in building a stronger edifice for the education system in Jamaica. It is a fact that across administrations, governments have been contemplating and seeking policy solutions as to how to enhance access of our citizens to the education system, especially higher level training and learning. A lot of these strategies have been necessitated by the changing work environment, as well as to empower our people to seek career and life opportunities, not just locally, but also internationally. And they have also been geared at accommodating those who may not have been successful throughout the formal education system. Over the past few years, we have had an expansion in training opportunities and programs offering Jamaicans and young people an opportunity to be better prepared for the 21st century marketplace. These programs are as much a response to the demand of the workplace, as I said before, but also a recognition that we needed to upgrade our labor market with the relevant skills and empower young school leavers to further upgrade their qualifications, hopefully through a tertiary route. It is out of the recognition for flexibility that programs such as the Career Advancement Program was introduced by now Prime Minister, then of Education, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, in 2010, as an alternative to the Caribbean Advancement Proficiency Exam. CAPE, as we all know, is aimed at preparing students for tertiary education for an additional 2 years through grades 12 and 13, sixth form basically, after obtaining their CXC secondary examination certificate. But CAP is oriented towards students who have completed their about 11 years of primary and secondary education without any formal certification that would enable to enter tertiary education or the labor market. And I want to take a second to speak about something that the Prime Minister has spoken about on several occasions, and it's the government's initiatives and hope and attempts to upend the production line education system that we have, where there is more or less, in many cases, children entering the system and leaving it without value added. And I think the CAP program is one of the programs that was geared towards assisting in upending that sort of situation that has become worse over time. After completing CAP, students can matriculate into occupational degrees or associate degrees, which are more aligned to competency-based education and training. Both CAP and CAPE follow a 2+2 concept. In the case of CAP, this concept implies that the first 2 years are completed in high school, grades 12 and 13, and can lead to an associate degree. As a result, students who obtain an associate degree can be entitled to a reduced study duration and the final 2 years can be completed at the bachelor's level. That is the hope. The measure is expected to lead to improved transition rates from upper secondary to higher education and efficiency gains for students by lowering the time and cost associated with a higher education degree. And the government by getting students to produce and graduate faster. The aim clearly is to widen the pool of qualified, technically competent Jamaicans by providing access to a seamless pathway between academia and technical and vocational education. We've also seen more young people pursuing occupational degrees in industry sectors. I digress from my mission, and I want to mention that the Jamaican society has a diverse mix of educational institutions. It's still considered not as equitable as it should be. This is not as the original access to some who could afford it at the time. The education revolution of the 60s and 70s did not do much to provide access, did not do much to provide quality, but was focused on access. Built many schools and schooled many children, but at the same time created a two-tiered system of traditional and non-traditional institutions. Currently, we see the manifestation of this challenge. While governments have done a lot of work in improving the system, a systematic look is now necessary, hence the recently launched Education Commission. We must continue initiatives such as CAP. We must continue other initiatives that will give our young people opportunities to take advantage of different pathways to access higher education. When young people are not adequately prepared for life, they find the transition into adulthood very difficult. Analysis of the youth and adolescent engagement with the security forces will demonstrate that a vast majority of the young people who have negative engagements with the security forces and the courts are also young people who have had negative engagements with the education system and eventually have negative outcomes. Those who find the transition into adulthood difficult because they were not afforded or did not take advantage of the education system in the way that we all envisage, often lack discipline and the necessary skills to keep a job. We therefore recognize that any attempt at building equity in the system and allowing more of our people to engage with the higher education ecosystem where they can access learning opportunities via a variety of pathways will bring significant benefits to the socioeconomic profile of our society. Not only must we examine the tertiary system in terms of the pathways that can be created there, but we also, through the commission and through other avenues, examine the feeder systems that will provide people to these pathways in tertiary education. Our system operates more or less in dynamic social and cultural contexts with different levels and types of governance. Ensuring students can access and complete higher education requires a good level of coordination across different levels of education, as well as requiring the involvement of key stakeholders, such as the Ministry of Education, such as the owners and operators of universities, such as persons like Professor Morrison, who has invested many years of his life in promoting higher education. We must engage key stakeholders and policymakers, teaching staff, employees, employers, but most importantly, we must engage students. I am sure the research findings will enlighten us on some of the challenges and opportunities of these areas. And I trust that you will have a successful webinar And we at the ministry look forward to receiving the research findings and see to what extent we can adopt your findings to enhance positive change within the sector. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for participating. And thank you very much for coalescing around this very important initiative.
Thank you very much, Minister Morgan. What you have just explained in your speech will be reflected in the findings from the research team. And we now segue right into Dr. Michaela Martin's presentation. She will be presenting on giving us an overview of the International Research Project. And after that, we will have the presentation from the research team. So, Minister, what you have said provided an entry into the discussion on the Jamaica's case study. Dr. Michaela Martin, who joins us from UNESCO head office in Paris, has a track record of more than 25 years in research, teaching, higher education policy, governance, and planning. At the UNESCO International Institute for Education Planning, she specializes in higher education and has been in charge of international research and training programs in the area of internal and external quality assurance. The global research on the flexible learning pathways in higher education falls within her remit. Dr. Martin will now provide an overview of this research project. Dr. Martin?
Thank you so much, Althea, for these very kind words of introduction. First of all, I would like to extend the greetings of the IIEP director, Dr. Sung Grant Lewis, who cannot be with us today as she has other commitments. I would like to address her greetings to the State Minister, Morgan, to the chairperson of UGCJ, Professor Morrison, Althea, Farial, my colleague from UNESCO, all distinguished participants and guests to this webinar. Just some words about our institute. The International Institute for Educational Planning is an institute of UNESCO, created in 1963. It's a technical institute whose main mission is capacity development and educational planning and management for UNESCO member states. We are doing quite a number of research projects as well, like our project on flexible learning pathways. And I want to take the opportunity actually of this webinar to thank the University Council for Jamaica, our partner organization in this research, and of course the two authors, Dr. Dawn Barrett Adams and Dr. Carolyn Hale, for their strong involvement and strong dedication to conducting the research and concluding on it as well. Just trying to move the PowerPoint. It's not moving. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. So let me just say some words about the background of this research very shortly, because we could spend a lot of time on that. But worldwide, we are faced with a massive higher education expansion. So over the past 20 years, we have moved from 100 million students worldwide to more than 220 million students, and this has gone hand in hand with a massive growth in the number of higher education institutions, a higher education diversification in terms of types of higher education institutions, public, private, university, non-university, cross-border provision, and an ever more student population. And that creates, of course, a challenge for higher education systems to articulate in such a way that there are no dead ends. I think that's the important point about flexible learning pathways, is that we have articulations that allow students to move through the higher education provision to access flexibly, as Professor Morrison has underlined, but also to progress and to complete and to move on to the labor market. Can we have the next slide? Yeah, so higher education systems are becoming more fragmented, and therefore we need greater mechanisms for their integration. So more students are getting into higher education, but the representation of disadvantaged groups remains relatively low, or we find them in lower prestige segments of the higher education provision. The expansion calls for higher education provision to be adapted to lifelong learning, to allow students actually to enter higher education flexibly, perhaps to move out, to re-enter at later stages without being confined to duration and pace of study. But that is often not reflected in practice. Can we move on? Yet we have an international development agenda for education, SDG 4 and Education 2030 agenda that Farial has reflected upon. They call for more flexible learning pathways in higher education that can support equity and lifelong learning. So flexible learning pathways are defined in this agenda as entry points, re-entry points, at all ages and all educational levels, strengthened links between formal and non-formal structures, and recognition, validation, accreditation of the knowledge, skills, and competences acquired through non-formal and informal education. Can we move on? In our research, we look at flexible learning pathways that lead to a qualification. So the way we have defined the scope of this research, and I think we have all understood, is a very broad term. We are looking at alternative admission pathways, so alternative modes for access, opportunities for transfer, as well as instruments supporting flexible learning pathways. So it's about pathways for getting into higher education, pathways for getting through higher education, and pathways for getting out of higher education completion and moving to the labor market. Can we move to the next slide? But there are many barriers in developing flexible learning pathways. We may have a weak policy environment for flexible learning pathways. Sometimes there are policies, but there's not enough guidance to higher education institutions on how to implement them. There may be administrative fragmentation. Often in many higher education systems, we have a segment of the governance structures focusing on academic higher education, another one on higher professional education, and there's often not much coordination between the two. And institutional autonomy may limit the capacity of the state to steer change. And often there may be competition between higher education institutions, competing for the best students, competing for funding, competing for the best staff, which discourages collaboration. And at the institutional level, there could be differences between institutions and types of provision, the curriculum, pedagogies, and assessment. There can be different institutional cultures, hierarchies of prestige, and lack of trust in the education provided in another type of higher education institutions. And many times, information and guidance may be missing or ineffective. Can we move on? So as Althea said, the overarching objective of our research is to produce knowledge and provide evidence-based policy advice to higher education authorities located in different development contexts who are considering building or strengthening flexible learning pathways as an area of future reform. Can we move on? So what we are looking at is policies, regulatory frameworks, instruments and practices that support flexible learning pathways in higher education. And we look at how these policies and practices, how effective they are working at the level of higher education institutions. So in the project, we have moved down to the level of institutions and to get a feel of the implementation of these policies. And we look at how these policies support the access, progression, transfer, and completion of those identified as disadvantaged groups in the case countries. And finally, we aim at identifying lessons learned from the experience regarding key enablers and factors lacking. Can we move on? So what we have been doing was first a stock-taking exercise to collect baseline information on policies, regulatory frameworks, instruments, and practices. And it was supported by an international survey conducted among ministries of education in UNESCO member states. And then we have moved to the case studies. Now, let me say that for the case studies, IIEP has prepared the research framework, but the data was collected and the data was analyzed and the conclusions drawn by the research teams based in the countries. And of course, as I mentioned, we are very proud that we could work with Dawn Barrett-Adams and Carolyn Hale in the Jamaican, for the Jamaican case study. Can we move on? So here are the countries. Yeah, Althea, you have mentioned them. So of course, in the Caribbean, Jamaica. Can you move on so that we can see the different countries? So in Europe, it's Finland and the United Kingdom. In Asia, it's India and Malaysia. In the Arab region, Morocco. And in Africa, South Africa. And finally, in Latin America, it's Chile. Here are already some products that we can share. So we have published a stock-taking exercise taking stock of good practices internationally. We have one of the first national case studies published. This is the Finnish case study. So these documents are available as published work and can be shared and is currently also shared internationally. What we would also like to do in the course of this webinar is to share actually a link to a summary that we have drawn from the Jamaican case study. So while the research report is under finalization, so it's pretty much finalized, we have already prepared a country synthesis that we will share, I think, during this webinar. Can we move on? So, and why the choice of Jamaica as a country case? So we have chosen countries representing diverse regions with different stages of implementation and focus of FLPs. So a number of countries are already quite advanced with the development and implementation of flexible learning pathways, while others are more at the beginning. And so we wanted really to look at countries with diverse levels of implementation. So Jamaica is a country with a focus on equality and equity policies. And I think this is quite obvious, particularly in the TVET sector, where really the country has made a lot of progress in the development of equity-related policies and in the provision of both funding and opportunities for study to disadvantaged students. And in Jamaica, there's an interesting set of holistic FLP policies. There is flexibility in access as part of the K13 strategy. Minister has mentioned the career advancement program. But there is also recognition of prior learning, more developed in the TVET sector again, and funding available from the PASS program. And flexibility during studies, the occupational associate degree and the 2+2 models are quite was an interesting measure that we have studied, or that was studied under the National Research Report. So what we found in Jamaica is that there are a number of long-standing policies in place, and others are currently under development. And so FLPs are already implemented across higher education institutions. And it was very interesting to take a look at the enablers and the obstacles to implementation of flexible learning pathways, and to be in a position to share lessons internationally from the Jamaican experience. Okay, can we move on? So here are some references that we want to share with the audience. I think the PowerPoint will remain available perhaps on the website of the University Council of Jamaica, so that participants can access it. And yes, and then I come to the end of my presentation, and just again to express my gratitude both to the University Council of Jamaica and to both Carolyn and Dawn for their very active participation in this research. We are now looking forward to hearing about the findings.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin, and thank you for highlighting that Jamaica already has policies in place, policies developed through the Ministry of Education, and that these policies focus on equality as well as equity. We also note that you had highlighted the barriers as well as the questions. Yeah, there are 4 questions which the research teams are expected to answer. And so we move right now into the presentation from Drs. Hale and Barrett Adams, because it is the findings from their research. You will see how Jamaica would have had systems in place to respond to those questions. As Dr. Martin had said, the 8 countries would have had research teams, and each participating country would have had at least 2 researchers. One must be from a national quality assurance and accreditation agency, such as the UCJ, and the other should be an independent researcher from the country with expertise in higher education, flexible learning pathways, and social science research methodology. So we all have been introduced to Drs. Hale and Barrett Adams. And just by way of brief introduction, Dr. Hale is the lecturer, researcher, and former chairman of the UCJ. She's the independent consultant, while Dr. Barrett Adams, the UCJ's accreditation officer, is our main focal point on this project. The team will now present their findings on flexible learning pathways in Jamaica and how we can move forward towards an integrated higher education system. I now hand over to the team.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Heron. Minister of State Robert Morgan, Mrs. Risden, Professor Morrison, Chairman of UCJ, Mrs. Althea Heron, Dr. Michaela Martin, Ms. Juliana Furif, Dr. Khan, Ms. Serpa Moitas from Finland, distinguished audience and dear colleagues in Jamaica, Chile, South Africa, Morocco, Malaysia, India, and UK, good morning and good afternoon. In today's presentation, we will share the findings for the study conducted by the UCJ as part of the international research project looking at flexible learning pathways in higher education. Specifically, this project allowed us to evaluate the progress made by Jamaica in providing equitable and inclusive access to quality higher education and lifelong learning opportunities, and at the same time addressing equity in relation to the participation of disadvantaged sections of the population. Next slide, please. The definition used by UNESCO is provided in this slide. We should take note of the practices and instruments indicated in this definition. Certainly, entry and re-entry points at all ages suggest lifelong learning opportunities. We have skills and competencies acquired through formal and informal education, implying the need for an assessment system for prior learning, and Professor Morrison articulated that very well. And then the formal structures, CSEC, CAPE, and CAP, as well as informal structures, which is experiential learning, in recognition of learning through that means. Another important element is accreditation, which provides the recognition of the program or institution and indicates that the program or institution has met quality standards. This also provides confidence to all stakeholders regarding the educational provisions of our higher education institutions that have gone through the UCJ's quality assurance and accreditation process. And might I add that this is a robust system and is recognized not just locally and internationally. UCJ has made its mark in quality assurance and accreditation internationally. Next slide. Now, when undertaking this project, we conducted a review of the context of higher education in Jamaica. Suffice to say, the project identified the 4 stages, which dated back to the post-emancipation period in the 1830s. To a large extent, the higher education system continues to reflect formal requirements to enter higher education, which was modeled off the British system at that time. Of note is the CSEC and CAPE requirements, which replaced the GCE O-levels and A-levels. Over the years, the focus of higher education in Jamaica has been on providing equal opportunities, and successive governments have actually adopted this as their own priority. Next slide. Now, if we look at the impact of equality, and this is demonstrated in this slide, for a long time, higher education in Jamaica developed along 2 pathways based on the common entrance placings, and this common entrance was introduced in 1957. So while equal opportunities were provided, this examination based on students' performance, they were now streamed along 2 diverging tracks. We have the academic track, which was reserved for the higher performing students, and traditionally they were placed in the high schools, the traditional high schools. I referred earlier to the formal requirements of CSEC passes and CAPE units, which would then matriculate these students into UWI. And this, as Professor Morrison indicated, reflects a regimented system. The other track, which was now the TVET track, was where the lower performing students would go on, and they were placed in the secondary schools, which only offered 5 years of education. Unlike the academic track, students had the option to do 6 forms, and so they had options for 7 years of education. Along this TVET track, there were dead ends, and perhaps could have explained why a number of students disappeared from that system, that is the secondary schools, which have since then been upgraded to high schools. Of course, CAP, as you have heard before, has addressed this problem and was one of the focus for this study. There's also the emerging tension or confusion regarding the role of the UCJ vis-a-vis JTech. Next slide. Now, it's important to note in this slide that we're seeing the difference between equality and equity. So while our education system promoted providing equal opportunities to all, it actually promoted elitism. Now, equity means providing a pathway so that all the students can participate in higher education, while equality means setting the standard so that those who have the means to access it can. So therefore, what you recognize that, and which perhaps was not given enough consideration, is really the socioeconomic conditions under which different persons find themselves, and these could have impacted their ability to access those equal opportunities that were provided for all. And so we have found as part of this project that PATH has been that solution to enabling the vulnerable or disadvantaged ones in Jamaica to access higher education. Well, not just higher education, but from primary, secondary, up to higher education. Next slide, please. Of course, higher education was not without a number of issues which prompted reform activities aimed at improving the sector. Of course, we had the task force on education reform, and there were some concerns regarding funding and the output from higher education, which was felt was not commensurate with the investments made. We had the transformation team that was put in place, and there were some decisions that were taken in 2011, which they would have given leadership to. And more recently, we had some higher education consultations, which were held in 2018. Of course, funding, elitism, etc., were some of the issues that were highlighted in that summit that was held in 2018. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, right. So the role of higher education, next slide, in enabling economic growth and competitiveness is recognized internationally as it provides employability skills and drives research and innovation. But higher education also addresses, next slide, social issues and breaks that vicious cycle of poverty, violence, and unemployment. And we believe that breaking this cycle will put Jamaica on the path of development. And just to pause here to recognize the merger of the Jamaica Foundation for Lifelong Learning, Hard Trust. We also have the Apprenticeship Board and NYS. And I think that's a good initiative in Jamaica because now it provides access for all adults to enter into higher education. And that will be seen later on in the findings that we will be showing. Next slide, please. So Vision 2030 is important to realizing that increased enrollment, and certainly as we look towards that world-class education and training system in Jamaica. Now the priorities for higher education emanating from this Vision 2030, next slide, includes increasing enrollment, next slide, please, and having at least 80% of eligible cohort pursuing higher education. This, of course, implies the implementation of flexible learning pathways aimed at increasing access. Of course, the terminology that was used is alternative pathways, and we're very familiar with that. But it is looking to still implicating flexible learning pathways. Now, Jamaica's education system, next slide, is indeed flexible, as was indicated by Michaela. It varies from one institution to another, and these features include diversity in institutions and teaching modalities. So we have the virtual, face-to-face, hybrid, full-time, part-time students, non-traditional students, and of course the 2+2 model, which allows students to enter into higher education, pursue 2 years for an associate degree, transition back into the workplace, and then they can come back into higher education and complete 2 years of upper level courses to be awarded a bachelor's degree. We also have the credit transfer system, which is used widely by many institutions, and students have used that to move from associate degrees into bachelor's programs or from one program into another program. And more recently, we had the CAP and the occupational associate degrees. These programs, that is the CAP and occupational associate degrees, are important and have been increasing access to and progression in higher education and forms a critical component of the integration of TVET in higher education. Next slide. This project was certainly relevant to Jamaica and facilitated an evaluation of the national policies and practices that support equitable and inclusive access to higher education, and allowed for evidence-based information to be provided to ministers of education in the various countries who have been contemplating reforms of their higher education system. Next slide. Please, next slide. This project consisted of 4 main components, specifically the evaluation of the effectiveness of policies, regulatory framework, instruments, and practices in place for establishing flexible learning pathways, evaluating the extent to which selected institutions have developed policies to promulgate flexible learning pathways consistent with the national priorities and regulatory framework. And this, we had the input of students giving evidence to whether or not these institutions have developed and they have benefited from these flexible learning pathways. Another component evaluated the effects of FLP on the disadvantaged students in Jamaica. And for this project, as I indicated earlier, we used path definition as those persons who we qualified as the disadvantaged students. Of course, we looked at the best practices and lessons learned regarding the implementation of FLP. And my favorite item is data, data, data. We have to evaluate and monitor the various flexible learning pathways so that we can inform improvement to our higher education system. Next slide. So the methodology essentially involved a review of available literature on flexible learning pathways in Jamaica and our higher education systems, as well as interviews with our national bodies and our higher education institutions. So there were 3 institutions which we selected to form part of this project, and we want to thank those institutions for participating in this project. Next slide, please. So we conducted a number of interviews. We actually had 91 persons who we interviewed. So we interviewed persons from the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and I want to acknowledge Mrs. Risden. We interviewed persons from the national bodies, totaling 8. And of course, we had sets of interviews at the 3 selected higher education institutions. Now, the focus for this research were on access to higher education, and looking at access, we actually looked at the recognition of prior learning, the career advanced placement program, and the PATH program. And then for progression through higher education, we gave focus to credit transfers and the occupational associate degrees. Next slide. Findings, yes, the exciting part. So we'll go to the next slide. And what we found were that the legislation are sufficient. That is, we have the Education Act that speaks to the powers of the Minister of Education in promoting, and you can go to the next slide, maintaining and sustaining tertiary education necessary for the growth and development of Jamaica, the governance arrangements, including institutional autonomy for all public educational institutions, and to provide for the grant of scholarships, bursaries, and other financial assistance, including loans for tertiary education. We also looked at the PART Act, and it was amended in 2019, and the functions provided in that act speaks to the providing financing for TVETs, schemes for trainees, development of training guidelines, and approving and certifying courses to be pursued by persons pursuant to the Act, and establishing and maintaining high standards in TVET. And of course, the UCJ Act, which grants UCJ the authority to confer academic awards. And through its QAA function, the UCJ has promoted the development of a robust IQA within institutions that ensures that the programs offered at these institutions meet required standards of quality. Next slide. It is to be noted that the Education Act also defines public educational institutions as any educational institution that is maintained by the minister and includes aided educational institutions. So whereas the older institutions were established and owned by various missionary groups, they became public by virtue of receiving a subvention from the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information, and hence the powers of the minister applies to these institutions and hence the control. So funding, control comes through funding. Next slide, please. The 2009 mandate given to HEART. Could we go to the next slide? Sorry. All right, the 2009 mandate given to HEART Trust did set into motion the integration of TVET in higher education. It started with the creation of a program to address the at-risk youth by providing alternative pathways, rebranding TVET as an alternative pathway, and allowing for the creation of an integrated education system. CAP is one of the programs that was developed. CAP allowed for the implementation of the grades 12 and 13 in the upgraded secondary schools, which are now high schools, and provided a parallel to the traditional sixth forms. So students now in these secondary schools were able to spend an additional 2 years at the secondary level. And this is reflected in the diagram as the senior school program. Of course, the branding of TVET incorporated the creation of the NVQJ certifications of levels 3 and above. So previously there was just 1 and 2, but now with the rebranding, we have the levels 3 and above. And these are actually reflected in our national qualifications framework, which we will come to. No, not yet. Thank you. This was enabled, this development of these other levels of NVQs was enabled through an evaluation of TVET programs against the programs offered in the community colleges to determine equivalency of standards, thus enabling movement between academic programs and TVET programs. Next slide. And so in this diagram, which was developed by Dr. Hale and Dr. Wayne Wesley, it shows equivalencies across the different types of institutions with one outcome, that of preparing a trained, competent, and globally competitive workforce at all levels. Next slide. This mandate given to HEART is captured in this K-13 strategy for education. It reflects an additional 2 years of schooling, as well as the CAP and OAD, that's the Occupational Associate Degree programs, and shows the progression from early childhood education up to the end of the extended secondary level education, which is that 7 years. Next slide, please. We are positing in this presentation that the NQF is that national instrument for flexible learning pathways, as it clearly articulates the following. And please note that it reflects the academic programs which formed part of the TQF. It reflects the NVQ, which is part of the TVET certification, and it also reflects the occupational degrees. And based on this diagram, what we're seeing is that the TVET certification levels are highlighted. Academic certification levels are there, and the occupational certification levels. And you will see that there's an equivalency, or should I say comparability in standards at the various levels indicated in that framework. And so there's a seamless and integrated higher education system which allows for multiple entry and re-entry points starting from level 1 and which is facilitated through a prior learning assessment system. The PLA system, that's the prior learning assessment system, would be implemented and monitored at the level of the institutions in the higher education system. So as Professor Morris said, whatever that students that student comes in, you would do an evaluation, take them through your PLA system, and then you would determine at what level you would place that student. It might mean matriculation, or it might also include articulation or advanced placement, as we know that term in Jamaica. It also allows for transfers between levels and across program types, that is the TVET, the occupational associate degrees, and the academic programs. And of course, lifelong learning opportunities at each level of the framework would facilitate modular courses for workplace certification. Next slide. Based on the findings, we have found that the higher education institutions have implemented prior learning assessment system. This is, however, mainly used for matriculation and in some cases for exemption from courses. TVET has a recognition of prior learning system that is used for certification. Overall, though, there was a general lack of understanding of the NQF and its application. And it was also not being used by the labor organizations. Next slide. Now we did a comparison of the ISCED with the NQF and the program offerings of the higher education institutions in Jamaica. And we saw that there was a diversity of programs being offered in the institutions. And so institutions, tertiary institutions, universities were offering the occupational degrees, which are TVET type programs, as well as the academic programs. And so we're seeing integration of TVET, not only in grades 12 and 13 and at the secondary level, but also at the higher education level. Next slide, please. There's also the credit transfer system, the 2+2 model, which I spoke about earlier. And it has been used extensively in a number of public tertiary institutions. And we actually found that it is being applied to the occupational associate degree, meaning students who completed the occupational associate degree can articulate into an academic program. But at the time when we did the interviews, the evaluation for bridging courses was being done. At this point, I think I'm going to hand over to my co-presenter, Dr. Caroline Hale, who will take us through the next few slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. I'd like to now look at the NQF. We looked at the NQF, as we pointed out, the NQF. No, we need to go back one, please. Please go back one. The NQF, right. So the NQF, as Dr. Adams points out, is the leveler, as we call it, because the NQF works with, the NQF is the framework that allows for the evaluation of the system, but it's also the mechanism that allows the government to speak to the policies that they require to address the issues of the disadvantaged groups. So here we look at some of the experiences of the students. And in this case, the student was moving from one tertiary institution to another, using the full associate's degree and moving into a level 3 of the other program in another institution. So we know that the 2+2 works here. The other, can you move on? Next one, please. Right. No, the student looking, all right. So we're looking at equity and inclusiveness in higher education. So the CAP and the occupational degrees are free of cost, paid for by the government to the students, and are well-designed programs and aligned to the labor market needs. They allow the disadvantaged students to access higher education for, as Dawn had said earlier, sometimes it's socioeconomic reasons that they can't access this. It's not their academic ability or any deficiencies. Now the CAP gives dual certification because the CAP allows 3 tracks. You can do CAPE on CAP, you can do CXC on CAP, and you can have absolutely no qualifications, be brought up to an academic level, given skill certification, and your NVQs will also admit you. So you will see this running through the program. You see the different pathways that students use. So the NQF facilitates the pathways across levels and programs, and also takes into consideration the lifelong learning opportunities. Next slide. So in this instance, the student had 7 CXCs. Remember, the first one was using the 2+2. This one has 7 CXCs but had no money to attend college. So the student said the CAP gave him the opportunity to attend college. The experience so far has been great, and skill-wise is very important. How did they hear about it? They heard about it when they were graduating from the CAP program, and the Center for Occupational Studies reached out to them and informed them there were scholarships available. So they took advantage of that. Next slide. Next experience. In this experience, this student only had 2 level 2 NVQ and said, no, not everybody can afford 300,000 to get an associate's degree. So when he or she heard about the occupational degree, they accepted the scholarship, and they are now in the process of doing this bachelor's degree program. Next experience. So participation of the vulnerable is really important, and it is a NQF, and funding of the NQF at the various access points that will allow the government to control how the disadvantaged people access higher education. And I've discovered through that path in particular, discovered this morning actually, that path, there's a differential between the grant to the male student and the female students. And this is particularly important in Jamaica, where the males are marginalized. And so it is clear that the government has a policy through PATH to support the males. And you will see later on where you're noticing that because the PATH is not well known or probably linked with higher education, that maybe that's why there is a low participation of males. And this is something that we need to investigate. So there are extensive programs providing funding to ensure that the disadvantaged students benefit from FLP, and that it's not just the path. They don't block them off with just one avenue. They can have several pots of money that will facilitate their learning all the way through to the completion of the bachelor's degree. Next slide. So this student makes that point. The student says, I received a payment for PATH towards my school fees for grades 12 and 13. I did not have any money to come to university. There was a social intervention program, the SIP, where I had to do some 40 hours of voluntary work. So they allowed them to do voluntary work and community service, which was also a part of the initial creation of the CAP program, which didn't really pan out. But here it is, you see it somewhere else. We went to the PATH office. I went to the PATH office and asked them if they had any scholarships and what I would be and would I qualify. They said they had no scholarship, but they could give them a grant. So student got a grant. They got $100,000 a year towards the bachelor's degree. Next experience. This other student showed, in fact, we interviewed 2 students and each student had a sibling who had benefited from the full $100,000 per year PATH experience, along with other grants and bursaries. And this particular student gave the example of her brother, who both of them went through from primary school all the way through to university level with the support of PATH and other programs. And her brother has actually graduated and now works has a BSc in engineering and works for the government. She herself is, I think she was in the 4th year and about to complete. So you see the importance of these support systems, and it doesn't come from one side, it comes from many sides, and the government has created this network that supports the movement for the underprivileged people. And then she said here, she didn't have any money, and she thought at the time, she said, well, I spoke to my director, and the director said yes, she could get the funds, and so she used that, and here she is moving along in the program. Next experience. Okay. The weaknesses now. Here is where the major weakness is. And the Ministry of Education pointed out to us in the initial interview, the career academic advising and guidance. And this in thinking through and in developing the presentation, we felt that maybe this is also one of the reasons why the males are not participating. Not only do they not know that there is opportunity in terms of funding, but because they are not getting specific individual career advice and guidance, they're not aware of the many programs that are there. And there is another stumbling block which we will point out later that may also attribute to this deficiency. Now, so lack of the overarching policy for career guidance needs to be developed. The policies are there in the institution, but it's not an overall national policy which would support this kind of push. So some institutions are stronger on it and others aren't. Some look at work experience as part of that process. Some look at career placement. There are variations of it, but it's none of it is tailored directly to disadvantaged students. It's just across the board. Next slide. This is the downfall. As Dr. Adams pointed out, we don't collect data. Statin is well aware of the ISCED, which is the International Standard Classification for Education. They're aware of it and they're aware of all of the data that could be collected. In this project, IIEP provided us with a template for data collection, which we gave to the institutions that with which we worked, and we also gave it to the ministry. So what we need is to focus on the data collection because data is lacking. And because the data is lacking, you will see later on the government really doesn't have a way to know whether its imperatives that it has put in place and the supporting financing, is that really getting through to the target areas that they want, or is it even developing and pushing forward the labor market areas that need to be developed? So data, as Dr. Adams had said. Next slide. This is another major problem that we found on the ground. In 2 different institutions, it came up. The non-acceptance of the equivalence or comparison of TVET on the NQF. So first of all, they're not very familiar with the NQF and they already have inbuilt prejudices about TVET. So what happened was, even though the institutions were accepting the funding, the subvention from the government to support the costs, they support the occupational degree and to support the CAP, what happened was they were added on, they're add-on programs, rather than being a mechanism, a funding mechanism for the overall programs that exist in the institution that are supported by the career advice. So that needs to be looked at and refashioned so that the funding can really flow in a strategic manner and in a way that it creates competitiveness for the individual, for the institution, and for the country. It's not a second chance program. It's not an alternative program. Those words connote old mindset that we have, that one thing is better than the other. We prefer to use the term flexible learning pathways, and that they put the government financing behind those pathways in higher ed. Next slide. Labor market. We found that when we spoke to the institutions, the associations, they were very supportive of higher education, and at the executive level, they really did not know much about the NQF, nor did they know much about the actual standards that are developed. What we found was that there are individual members of the association, individual members from organizations and professions that are helping to shape the standards, but it is not organized and it is not widely disseminated at the executive level. So the communication between higher ed and the private sector needs to be improved. The next slide. The government, this is a framework that operates for equality and equity. This is the existing framework that operates through the government of Jamaica, through the Ministry of Education Act, the Education Act, the UCJ Act. The government looks at the higher education institutions, looking at the external quality assurance, looking at the National Qualification Framework and the RPL. And that is how UCJ looks to see if the policies that are on the ground in the institution are reflecting the national priorities and are in fact creating equality and equity. If you look on the heart on the other side of Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, through Heart Trust, they provide the funding for access at every level, from the remedial stage all the way through to research and development, which will be at level 8, and ensuring that the qualities are in the system. On the other end, you will see that there is a PATH program which support those that are disadvantaged, and those that are disadvantaged, creating again the equity in the system. But it is the quality assurance mechanism that is overseen by the UCJ that looks into the institution and looks at the internal quality assurance system and the classifications to make sure that the policies are reflecting the government mandate and the social and addressing the social issues. And then you see the students acquiring the knowledge and the skills for employment, and then they enter the labor market system. So this is the framework that supports that overall, that integrated higher education system. Next slide. Here again, just another review of the programs. To the left are all of the programs, and to the right are the mechanisms that the government uses through the 3 ministries to ensure that you have equity and equality. And particularly Ministry of Education is the one that drives all of these policies down into the system, looking at the system, and where we're weak is we're not collecting the data and linking it back to the national strategies. Next slide. So the major problem though, in addition to the lack of communication and the lack of data, this is a major finding. The lack of understanding of governance, which has led to administrative fragmentation because there are overlapping roles. The overlapping roles lead to indecisiveness, whether to close or open or what to do with this one, what to do with that one, role confusion, waste of resources, increased tension and territorialism, increased need to control because the system doesn't understand what is happening. They believe that control is what we need. The government already has systems in place to control and to monitor. It's through the quality assurance system. And then the worst part of it is the poor communication, which fuels the continued lack of understanding of governance. So if we were to make one recommendation, the first thing to look at would be the governance, straightening out the administrative fragmentation, and then the things will flow. Next. Recommendations. All right. Again, looking at the application of governance in higher education. Institutional autonomy is a bugbear, but what the institutional autonomy gives the authority. There are only 2 acts in Jamaica that give the authority to confer degrees. One is the Education Act, and that runs through the power of the minister to grant a scheme order to the public entities. And the other is the UCJ Act, which gives power for the UCJ to award degrees in an instance where an institution has programmatic accreditation, but no institution autonomy. The institutional autonomy is the organization within the institution and how its policies and procedures reflect the government policies, national imperatives, and other externalities. In other words, how they service their stakeholders. On the other hand, the second instrument where you're looking at the application of governance for higher education is the quality assurance and accreditation that looks at program accreditation and institutional accreditation. And through those processes, the teams look at mission effectiveness. Are you doing the things that you say above? Do you have an effective institutional governance framework in place and the authority to do what you say you want to do? Is it appropriate for the level and classification and the standards you are using? And then we look at the effectiveness, the teaching and learning systems, the student success, employability, citizenship, and overall competitiveness for the individual, for the institution, and for the country. Next slide. So in summary, we're looking at now world-class education and training, because this is goal 1. one of the outcomes of goal 1 for our 2030. And you notice it cannot be achieved by any one element. You're looking at resources and financing, the socioeconomic issues, employment, inclusiveness and equity, employability, labor market. So you're looking at knowledge, skills, and ability, and the quality education and training, governance, access, progression, teaching, and learning. All of them come together to give us the world-class training, education, and training system that we have as an outcome for goal 1 on the 2030. Next slide. The funding is in place. As we went through, the funding is in place through the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, Ministry of Education and Youth through its subventions, and the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation through Heart Trust. Those systems are in place. What needs to be addressed is the higher education institutions need to include the national imperative in their existing programs. Use the career guidance to determine the programs that support the national imperatives, and then use those to attract the minority group, not minority because they're not minority, the disadvantaged groups into the system and overall, and then so we need a cohesive policy that puts the funding, which is in place, behind the career guidance and the marketing strategies that will then reach the target market that we require. So we need to look at the funding model. The money is there. It's how we streamline it to best support the national imperatives. Next slide. So as you see here, quality assurance is the entire process, which begins with the recognition of prior learning and the access points 1 on the NQF and goes all the way to level 8, the matriculation and articulation and the credit transfer system, the national application and movement on the national qualification framework, and again, the quality assurance mechanisms and accreditation processes that are in place. All of these come together to give the government the ability to control the system and to ensure that everybody is accessing a good quality education, and it is being given, there's equity and there is equality in the system. So here we show you the competitiveness and control, the funding mechanism. Funding aligned to the NQF by level will drive the national imperative. It also drives the labor market needs, and it drives the imperative for equity. That now will go through the NQF and the RPF in the actual institutions, and then the QA system, the quality assurance system, looks at the system to make sure that everything is working smoothly. So you can see it's a holistic approach to competitiveness and quality control. We end the presentation with a very interesting quote from the Permanent Secretary, Mrs. Risden, who is present on here. She's the Permanent Secretary of Ministry of Labor and Social Security. When we interviewed her, she said, "We see education as a means to break that poverty cycle, recognizing that your income earning potential changes dramatically once you have tertiary level qualifications." We thank you for your attention.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Drs. Barrett Adams and Dr. Hale, for an interesting and provocative presentation. The information has spurred a lot of comments in the chat room, and we are happy that you have been able to show not just what our successes are in terms of flexible learning pathways, but as well as showing the areas for us to improve, particularly the funding elements. You also highlighted the fact that how important it is of the PATH program to provide that support to those who are vulnerable and disadvantaged in our society. And the highlighting of the fact that the NQF is the leveler right across all levels of the education spectrum from levels 1 right up to levels 8. So more questions will be coming to you, and we thank you for carrying us through this exercise and for presenting your findings. Our next presenter, Ms. Serpa Moitos, who is from Finland, from the Finnish Education Evaluation Center, unfortunately wasn't able to join us. So we are going to move right into the next presentation, which will be jointly presented by Dr. Michaela Martin and Ms. Uliana Furiv. Just to highlight that Ms. Uliana Furiv is an Associate Project Officer at the IIEP Research Office, and her research activities are in areas of higher education policy, planning and management, as well as quality assurance. And she is a research officer on this international project. So I now hand over to the team from UNESCO Paris.
Thank you very much, Althea, for the introduction. Greetings, distinguished guests and webinar participants. I'm very delighted, together with Michaela Martin, to share findings from 8 country case studies as part of our FLP's research on higher education. Next slide, please. Yes. As was mentioned earlier, the research produced 8 country case studies from Chile, Finland, India, Jamaica, Morocco, Malaysia, South Africa, and the United Kingdom, thus providing for quite a global picture on FLPs in higher education. We have looked at both policies and practices that these countries have in place for FLPs. Both global and local trends have shaped countries' policies for flexible learning pathways. Most prominently, however, the national policies that support FLPs are framed under the Human Resource Development Agenda and the Equity Agenda. For example, in Jamaica, Vision 2030 aims at world-class education and training system by providing opportunities for all, including the disadvantaged groups. Next slide, please. In our research, we studied, as was mentioned before, 3 stages of FLPs, namely in access, during studies, and towards graduation. These are, for example, examples of flexibility initiatives, policies, and practices available in the Jamaican case study. As you can see, there are policies and practices in Jamaica, both at the national and institutional level, that facilitate flexible learning pathways at all stages. Some practices, as was highlighted in the earlier presentation, could be enhanced. Next slide, please. We found that most prominently preparatory programs, alternative admissions, including through recognition of prior learning, and transfer policies support flexibility in access in the studied countries, namely in Finland, Chile, and Jamaica, South Africa, and the UK. Preparatory programs create more flexible access pathways between upper secondary level and higher education. For example, in Chile, preparatory programs in high schools ease the transition of students into higher education by emphasizing academic skills needed for students to cope in higher education institutions. And there are extended curricular programs in higher education institutions in South Africa. There are foundational years in further education colleges and universities in the UK. And in Jamaica, within a K-13 strategy, the Career Advancement Program and the Occupational Associate degree allow students to pursue education also flexibly and choose either to further the studies or transition to the bachelor level studies or to enter the labor market. Of course, branding these, there is an issue of branding of these programs as second chance programs, as was mentioned earlier, and also in other countries this has been noted, for example, in South Africa. And there is a need, of course, to mainstream these pathways as flexible learning pathways and as having equal standing as traditional pathways. Flexibility in access can be facilitated also through transfers. The studied countries support both national and internal transfer systems. Internal transfer systems are often facilitated through inter and intra-institutional agreements. For example, in Finland, transfers are carried out through a national application procedure to lift the pressure from the admission system so that students do not have to reapply again if they're not satisfied with their choice. In Jamaica, a 2+2 model allows for transfers between institutions and programs as well after completing 2 years, for example, in community colleges and moving, for example, to a bachelor level studies in universities. What we found is that transfers between universities and TVET institutions generally across countries are less common. So this model in the Jamaican case is rather unique and is a commendable practice as it aims to ease as it aims to enable seamless transition of students based on trust and also comparability between programs and institutions. Next slide, please. Flexibility can be also enhanced through recognition of prior learning. Particularly in access. Countries that we study have both national and institutional led systems for RPL. For example, in Malaysia, there is a national system on accreditation of prior experiential learning, both for access and credit. There are even centers that specifically facilitate RPL in Malaysia. And in Finland, RPL is part of the institutional procedure. As was mentioned in the case of Jamaica, there's a system for awarding national vocational qualification certification for TVET institutions. And also there is an institutional practice for recognition of prior learning for mature entry at higher education institutions. But like in many countries, including Jamaica, RPL, of course, is a lesser mainstream route into higher education, and it is more often practiced by vocational institutions for recognition of labor competencies rather than academic institutions. So there's this need to link TVET and academic institutions qualifications for RPL under a common national qualification framework. Next slide, please. In terms of flexibility during studies, this varies by higher education institutions and by countries. It is typically delivered through more flexible study modes, for example, part-time provision, distance learning, evening classes, blended learning provision. These are available, these practices are available in all studied case countries. There are interesting, for example, there are interesting examples of specializations and cross studies. So students can study, take courses from different institutions in Finland. In India, there is a choice-based credit system where students have a set of core subjects and elective subjects that they can choose from. In Jamaica, as was noted earlier, 2+2 model allows flexibility, for example, in study location. It also allows flexibility in the change of programs. Next slide, please. Practices for flexibility towards graduation and transition to the labor market also vary across studied countries and across institutions. Some countries support flexibility, for example, in degree structures and organization of studies to enhance graduation and employability. For example, in Finland, higher education institutions facilitate internships in degree programs. Students can combine flexibly work and study periods. In the UK, there are accelerated degrees that shorten the time to complete a degree. And in Jamaica, the 2+2 model allows students to get associate degree after 2 years and move to the labor market if students do not wish or cannot pursue bachelor level studies. And now I will pass on to Michaela Martin to introduce some mechanisms that support flexible learning pathways in addition to the above mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Uliana. One part of our research was looking at governance frameworks, and in the different case studies, we asked the research team simply to describe the governance frameworks, but what we found out, what came out very strongly was that the governance framework matters a lot to either enable or otherwise create obstacles to the implementation of flexible learning pathways. So for instance, administrative fragmentation and typically a divide between the authorities in charge of academic higher education and professional higher education. But we have seen also very good examples, like for instance, in the case of South Africa, where the SAQA, the South African Quality Assurance Authority, is working with quality councils located in the different subsectors of the education system, from general education, TVET, and higher education, but still providing an overarching framework for the entire, for the management of the national NQF. Another very important item that came out as a strong feature supporting or not flexible learning pathways is the balance between regulation and autonomy. So that is a very difficult one because on the one hand, we can see that regulation is necessary to guide higher education institutions, but on the other hand, higher education institutions also have to find local solutions to problems. So we need to find an appropriate balance here. And what we could see was that the implementation of FLPs is similar across higher education institutions in regulated higher education systems, one of it being Jamaica. We saw Jamaica as an example of a more regulated higher education system. And the implementation of flexible learning pathways varies across higher education institutions in decentralized higher education systems. And what we can see there is that institutions group together, but as in partial segments and under criteria of hierarchy of prestige in many times to create articulation, but only among them. So if we want to reach a broader systems-wide articulation of the higher education system, we need also stronger regulation. Can we move to the next slide? So funding for the implementation of flexible learning pathways is very important. Government funding mechanisms strongly support FLP. So we have seen, for instance, in Jamaica, the provision of funding through the PASS program to disadvantaged students, allowing them to study without paying fees in higher education institutions. And that is something that I think is a strong supporter. A good example comes also from Finland, where the government has provided funding for higher education institutions to participate in consortia to implement together flexible learning pathways, such as initiatives to create e-learning courses in Finland. And we thought it was a very good example of government promoting collaboration within the higher education system rather than competition among institutions. And student support, of course, is a very strong enabler for access and retention of equity groups in flexible learning pathways. So for instance, we could see in Finland that those students that benefit from access to fee-free higher education have also much stronger retention rates. Can we move on? Yes, and quality assurance and NQFs are very important to implement flexible learning pathways. So QA, of course, provides the trust in the higher education system, not only to students, but also to the providers themselves to create articulation. But it can be also, it can look at flexible learning pathways like through studies across the higher education systems to look into the implementation of recognition of prior learning and to compare and provide good and make available good practices, for instance. That is something very important that a QA can offer. Or a QA can also propose guidelines for the implementation of recognition of prior learning and ODL. We have seen that in a number of countries where, for instance, India is offering guidelines, India and Malaysia are offering guidelines for the implementation of ODL programs. And finally, the NQF is, of course, a very important tool for facilitating understanding and comparability of qualifications. And yeah, in Jamaica, yeah, the NQF. So I think, but I think what is important also is that these tools exist and are sound and create trust. But it is also important that they are known to higher education institutions. So when it comes to making decisions about recognition of prior learning, the actors at the level of the higher education institutions are using them. And we see that we have seen, and Carolyn, I think, has mentioned that this is perhaps an area where Jamaica can make further progress. Can we move to the next slide? So just a very last slide on, of course, some of the most important, we would think, enablers and barriers for the implementation of flexible learning pathways. There are a lot more, but just perhaps in a nutshell. So what we need is that FLPs encompass a holistic policy that emphasizes flexibility in access during studies and towards graduation. So it is really this system-wide focus that and looking into these three dimensions altogether. What is important also that we have a shared vision among the stakeholders in the system on the policy orientation on FLP, and as well an understanding that FLP can be a very strong instrument to enhance equity, both equity and equality in the higher education sector. The balance between regulation and autonomy for the implementation of FLP is also something very important. Regulation provides guidance, but it is very important to offer regulation that is not too constraining as well. So we need to find a balance between regulation and autonomy. Incentives and support for higher education institutions to implement FLP. So guidance is very important, or financial incentives to work together on projects can be a very strong means. It's not enough to have policies, of course, at the national level, but it is very important also to work with the higher education sector to implement them, and to implement them in a collaborative manner. And finally, I think it's something that has been emphasized also in Carolyn's and Dawn's presentation, is the importance of doing monitoring and evaluation of existing policies. And of course, monitoring and evaluation requires data. And let's say the collection, first the collection, and then the analysis and ongoing analysis of data on how, particularly on how equity groups participate in FLP would be really a commendable practice. But this is something that all the case studies identified, I think, as a shortcoming and something that they would want to work on in the future. So I want to stop here and I pass it back to Althea. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Michaela. And your presentation somehow mirrors what Doctors Hale and Barrett Adams had presented in their findings, as well as you show that there are similarities right across the 8 countries that had participated in this international project. What we also have learned is that there are barriers towards the implementation of flexible learning pathways, and that these are aspects that we as governments, we now have to take a strong review of to see how those barriers can be eliminated. It also endorses the fact that we do have a strong framework in place. So we now are at the point where we are going to be looking at the questions which were posted in the chat room, and I will now go to the question of the first question. Yes, the one question was whether or not the slides would be available, and yes, the slides will be available, and we will have them on the UCJ's website in a special area dedicated towards for this seminar. A question posed to Dr. Barrett Adams. Did the study look at the link between access to higher education and financial resources? It's a question to Dr. Barrett Adams. Dr. Hale, are you able to answer?
Yes, I am. Yes, it did look at access to financing, but remember, we were looking at the disadvantaged cohort. That's why we're looking at path. It didn't look at financing in a general sense, just specifically to the disadvantaged group. Does that help?
I should hope. Another question, and Dr. Hale, I'm going to ask you to take this one. It's about the NCTVET Level 2 standards and the material entry or equivalence of a high school diploma. And the question is, what is the equivalence of a high school diploma in our environment? I think they're referring to the NQFJ.
Yeah, that was previously done by JFLL at that time. No, it would be hard. Well, the equivalences or comparability would have to be done by UCJ against the NQF and the other policies that are in place. So it's difficult to answer in abstract. They would have the technical people actually have to do that analysis. But the framework is there for it to be done, and they do it every day on other areas.
Dr. Hale or Dr. Adams, this question is also for you. Professional bodies, example, the Nursing Council, dictate entry requirements in those professions to institutions. This seems to run contrary to goals of flexible learning pathways. How should this be resolved?
Dr. Adams there, or you want me to answer?
I'm trying. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Heron. Yes, we recognize that we have been so regimental to the formal requirements, and it's really the British system. And so the NQF provides that opportunity. And I think because the communication regarding the NQF needs to be done, and persons need to accept it and use it. So we're at that stage where we're saying we're all, and perhaps it has to be driven. It is part of the UCJ, and we're suggesting, and I'm going to be bold enough to indicate that the NQF just needs to be fully developed. Certainly the credit system is going to be needed to support it, and maybe recommend that it be placed within the UCJ as a tool to accompany quality assurance and accreditation.
If I may comment, specifically with respect to the Nursing Council, those are admittance to the professional bodies. In terms of the accreditation, as I understand it, unless it has changed, UCJ does not speak to the health professions. That is done by CAMHP. Am I correct, Mrs. Heron?
You're correct. Next question. Have we considered that males limited that males' limited participation in educational programs stem from their need to earn to take care of their responsibilities. Anyone from the team could answer, because this might have an international perspective as well.
Michaela, did you? Well, the comment that I realized this morning that that PATH does have a differential payment for males, and obviously it's driving the government imperative because the government is aware of the fact that males are marginalized. So they have provided for the provisions. They have the money there to support the males. And if you look at the NQF and you look at the flexibility of the programs, the males would be able to participate and still work because of the nature of the programs. Or I should say the offering.
In terms of an international perspective, are you seeing the same?
In terms of international perspective, in most countries, it's actually not in most countries, I think in many countries, it's actually the females, let's say in an African context, you would more typically have the females. So what you see in many countries is that there are special scholarships that are provided for the females, that, for instance, bringing females into STEM subjects and the like. So this is something that you find internationally, yeah. I think, but it is also true that internationally we have now more females participating in higher education than males. Huh? But I think the differences is particularly striking in the Caribbean. So it's quite understandable that perhaps from a consideration of, say, opportunity cost, if a boy would have to enter the labor market at secondary level, that perhaps then the let's say the stipend is higher, perhaps to compensate for this loss in the opportunity cost for education. No?
Thank you very much, Michaela. There is another question asking about the sensitization.
Mrs. Aaron, I just wanted to also highlight that the Michael University College, they did have a special program, the preliminary upgrade program, where they targeted the involvement or engagement of men in higher education. So just to say that we have had an example of that, and that is something that, you know, based on the strategic priorities of the country, is an area that would have to be looked into and funding allocated accordingly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. This next question was actually asking about how have higher education institutions been sensitized about the NQF. I do know that there was a national launch of the NQF prior, and that the Jamaica Tertiary Education Commission had actually had sessions going around, the consultations going around the country in terms of sensitizing about the national qualifications framework of Jamaica. So yes, they were sensitized, and I would believe that it is an ongoing process. There's also a question about, I'm not certain if this person had understood.
Yeah. Could I perhaps say something on this? I think it's an interesting point about sensitization. Is it enough to sensitize? Would it not be also important to do capacity development of those people who use it? Huh? Because it's one thing of knowing that it exists. Another thing is to apply it for making decisions about credit recognition or, you know, recognizing non-formal learning and so on. So I think there is a task also, I do not know, for one of the actors in the system, maybe for University Council, to engage in capacity development within the higher education sector, the institutions, so that they engage with it and they use it, they start to use it.
Right, thank you, Michaela. More or less to show them how it works. And the benefits of facilitating the entry, the progress through, as well as the exit through higher education. Thank you very much.
And if I may, Mrs. Heron, because this is one of the things that we discussed, myself and Dr. Hale, we have to do the training, capacity building of the institutions to use the NQF. Of course, recognizing that there needs to be further development of the NQF so it can be used as our PS, Dr. Grace McLean, for the man on the street. to be able to understand it and use it.
If I may add, this is one of the areas of fragmentation that needs immediate attention because it sits outside of the quality assurance process. It needs to come over to the UCJ and to be fully meshed with the TQF.
Right, thank you very much, Dr. Hale. There's a question whether or not the ministry or the UCJ plans to address the access issues. And yes, we will address the access issues. We currently have programs and frameworks in place, and you would have heard that these frameworks have been successful, but right, there are gaps, and those gaps would be addressed. I think there's someone who is not quite sure about what happens to, in terms of the 2+2, regarding the associate, having an associate degree. The question is, after an individual would have graduated with an associate degree and would have had work experience, will flexible learning pathway allow for the institution to use portfolios for credits towards a bachelor's degree? That is supposed to any of the research team, based on the findings that you have. Yes, I know, we know that the two, okay, go ahead.
Yes, I'll take that, Mrs. Heron. Thank you very much. Right, so we have the 2+2 model, and really it allows for institutions would have to develop their own prior learning assessment system where they evaluate not just the formal qualifications, but work experience. I know that that is something, and our chairman spoke about it earlier, the experiential learning. And so it goes back to the student learning outcomes. So as you do an evaluation, it must be against your student learning outcomes for the program, and you determine at what level, whether it's a year 2, year 3, that you would articulate the students in. So it's not just about matriculation, but we're also promoting through the NQF and the prior learning system that there is an evaluation to determine articulation as well. So they would be able to enter based on, guided by the student learning outcomes.
And just to add that the associate's degree is a terminal degree. And so those credits transfer. Once it's from an accredited institution, it transfers fully. And then, as Dr. Adams said, the process kicks in from there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hale. Now, colleagues, this session has been a very informative exercise. The questions, many of the questions have been answered in the chat room, but unfortunately, time does not permit us to delve further into the other questions and comments which have been posted. We have been seeing some congratulatory comments about the webinar and the information provided. The project is timely as Jamaica seeks to conduct a reform of its own education sector, including the higher education. But we have a lot of takeaways. One is that Jamaica has good framework instruments in place to support flexible learning pathways, and that we also have the requisite legislation in place and the key national bodies and instruments that would enable us achieving our sustainable development goals, as well as our Vision 2030 national outcome. There is also a relationship between the NQF as well as the quality assurance and accreditation. And there is also strong advocacy for career guidance, career and academic guidance. These are, which is considered as just as important as an instrument to help to enable flexible learning pathways in higher education. We have noted that the PATH program is a valuable enabler and also facilitates persons from the lower socioeconomic group towards attaining higher education qualifications. There is also need for the development and implementation of policies to strengthen career guidance and consideration I have noted this from Dr. Hale's presentation, consideration is to be given to changing the term alternative pathways as it connotes, it could underline a second chance, it connotes a second chance, and this could undermine the efforts aimed at access and equity. And lastly, it's also what came out strongly is the whole matter of funding to enable the participation of the disadvantaged groups, additional funding, especially funding for the CAP program and the occupational associate degrees program. So I would like to express sincere appreciation and thanks to Minister Morgan for bringing greetings, Dr. Khan for her special remarks, which both were well received. Also thank the research team from UNESCO, as well as Drs. Hale and Barrett Adams for sharing the highlights on unearthing areas of importance or improvement for us to implement and strengthen our FLP policies. To the UNESCO team, thanks for your foresight and for conceptualizing this project and your leadership and advice throughout, because I know that you have been giving that advice to the team. And this research could not have been undertaken without the involvement of the representatives of the Ministry of Education and its agencies, the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, all the national organizations who had participated in the interviews, as well as the principals of the institutions who willingly accepted and facilitated the research team with the necessary data needed. And yes, data, we need to collect more data using the ISCED template, as well as using that information in strengthening our monitoring and evaluation, because that is how we would know if we are fulfilling the necessary outcomes that we need to achieve for Vision 2030, as well as supporting fulfilling the goals of the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. I would also like to thank the UCJ team who have worked tirelessly towards bringing this webinar to fruition. Thanks also to Professor Morrison for bringing opening remarks. And lastly, again, I would like to apologize for Ms. Serpa Moitas, who is a counselor for the Council of Evaluation from the Finnish Education Evaluation Center. She was slated to present the Finnish experience and to provide a comparison between the Finnish model and the Jamaican model. However, she was having technical difficulties and was not able to join. So at another opportunity, we'll see how we can bring her in. But again, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for participating. Thank you for joining. And I now bring this webinar to an end. Have a good evening, good night, good day. Bye-bye.